Welcome to lesson 2. Today's topic will be focusing on looking at an overview of the solid waste management process. So we'll begin first of all by looking at what the objectives of solid waste management are. Previously we would have looked at the definition of solid waste. So how do we go, what is the objective, what is the purpose behind managing this type of waste, or all these various types of waste that we would have looked at. So the objective of solid waste management is to minimize the adverse environmental effects caused by indiscriminate or irresponsible disposal of the waste that we produce, particularly when we're dealing with hazardous waste. Because if you recall from the previous lesson, hazardous waste is any kind of waste that could cause or has potential to cause harm to human life, animals, and the environment. So we have to be very careful about how we handle that type of waste, even from the perspective of producing that kind of waste. So again, the purpose is to minimize the adverse environmental effects caused by these types of wastes. So that was the objective of solid waste management. Let's look briefly at integrated solid waste management. So even as the words integrated suggests, when we are looking at solid waste management, an integrated solid waste management approach is one that employs a number of different strategies to work together to get the full benefit out of what our objective is, which is to minimize the adverse effects of the waste. So a solid waste management program, a good one and an integrated one, must achieve the following. It must enable us to either prevent or reduce the waste that we produce. So for example, using less material in order to get the job done, we would try to achieve this at the point of our waste generation, where we are actually creating the waste. An integrated solid waste management program should also facilitate waste recycling. So if we have a waste recycling program set up in our community or our nation, it means that we should have the following available. There should be a system in place for segregating or sorting our waste into like categories. The collection of that waste, for example, collection from the point of generation, such as homes, factories, etc. Once we collect this waste, where do we store it? You must have something in place for storage. And then removal of that waste now for the purpose of recycling. So there is a natural progression there. A little later on in the course, we will talk a little bit more about those processes that would be involved in waste recycling. Integrated solid waste management should also include a program for composting. So some of you may already be familiar with this type of waste management process. This is a process of collecting recyclable organic material and allowing it to decompose. For example, some of you may have a backyard compost heap where you would throw all your organics, such as food waste or even garden clippings, etc. And this decomposed material can actually be used as soil fertilizers. Then finally, we must also have something in place, a strategy for our final waste disposal. So there must be proper disposal of discarded material done in accordance with your local environmental guidelines or laws. Final waste disposal may include incineration, such as burning of the materials, or finally, such as landfilling. And this stage here is this is a very serious stage, because even the process of incineration or landfilling, if not done properly according to whether it's international environmental guidelines or local environmental guidelines, can lead to further negative impacts on the environment, because you can end up producing further waste or allowing waste such as leaching from your landfills to indiscriminately enter your water courses and groundwater supplies. Right, so as mentioned before, what we're looking at on this slide is really just a schematic representation of integrated solid waste management. So as mentioned before, you must be interested as part of your management plan, not only what is happening at the source of the generation of the waste, but what programs and systems do you have in place for collection. For example, do you have many of our local government corporations in Trinidad, regional corporations, you find they would often be involved in arranging schedules and systems for the collection of waste in your different communities. You see the garbage trucks coming out at certain times, on certain days for collection. When that is collected, what is the next step? Where does that garbage go to next? For us, many of us, it goes immediately to the landfill. But in some other countries, such as larger countries, you find there would be an intermediate storage stop where you will have the waste transferred to what we call a transfer station. Later on in the semester, we will talk about transfer station. From there now, the waste must go, if you have a good integrated solid waste management program in place, it should either go for energy recovery, as we can see at the top there with the ERRF. If you look at the bottom, it's defined there for you. That's resource recovery facility. That's where we can recover energy from the waste. Alternatively, we can transport the waste to a facility where disposal and recycling can take place. That's your materials recovery facility. Okay, so those are alternatives to landfilling. So let's look next at the solid waste management hierarchy. Now, what is this hierarchy? The solid waste management hierarchy establishes the preferred order of solid waste management alternatives. Alright, so I'll go to the next slide so we can actually see what I'm talking about here. Here we have a diagram representing this hierarchy. Remember, this is the order in which we prefer it. So if you follow with me and you go to the most preferred at the top, least preferred at the bottom. You really want to manage waste first of all by attempting to reduce the amount of waste that's being produced at the very source. As mentioned before, that would be, for example, in our homes. Different strategies we can apply to reduce the amount of waste we are producing in our homes. The next preferred strategy would be reuse. We can reduce waste by reusing some of the materials that we use, such as like plastic containers, bags, glass jars, etc. The more we reuse them is the less of the waste that goes to the landfill. Recycling. At this point I'm asking you to make sure that you are clear on the distinction between reuse and recycling. Reuse essentially allows us to reuse the product in a similar or different manner, whereas recycling actually remanufactures or redesigns the material into something else. So recycling is also an option, again allowing us to circumvent the traditional flow of the waste which would normally lead it to the landfill. So we reduce landfilling as an option there. Resource recovery is where we would attempt to identify and sort and put aside material that can then be used in incineration, for example. So incineration is where we would burn the material that we've recovered in order to generate fuel, again thereby reducing the amount of waste that goes to the landfill. And of course, landfilling is the least preferred method, because we have to remember that land is a finite resource, and especially where we live in a world where we have growing populations, and where you have a growing population, obviously you're going to have increased waste generation. And because land does not increase, it means we have a problem. So we have to find alternative and creative ways of reducing the amount of waste that goes to the landfill. Alright? And generally, again, as I said, when we deposit waste in the landfill, it takes some of that waste does not decompose at all. Some of the inorganic waste, and the rest of it, when it decomposes, some of it would produce toxic substances, and again, if not properly managed, that can get into our waterways and the hydrological cycle, contaminating our water supplies, our food, etc., and everything can come right back to us at the end of the day. So all of that is called feedback. Here on this slide, we want to try to understand briefly what this concept of materials flow in society is all about. So materials flow analysis is really what we are looking at, and what is the importance of this in terms of managing solid waste. So if you follow with me from the first point there, so solid waste, which would be the debris that's produced, is generated at every stage of a process, especially when you're talking about manufacturing, for example, from the raw materials to the final disposal, right? The principle of materials flow analysis is quantification and assessment of the materials that are used in the product and the waste that is produced. So we're trying to quantify how much we use and how much waste is produced at every stage of the process, and this is done for the purpose of resource conservation. Right? So we're doing this not only to reduce waste, but to manage how much of the resources, the natural resources, that is being consumed in order to produce that waste. So weaknesses in the input part of the manufacturing process, the processing stage, and the output stage, we have to evaluate at each of those stages where our weaknesses are in terms of the approaches and strategies that we take that actually produces an unnecessary amount of waste. So you identify those weaknesses for the purpose of improving on it so that we can reduce the waste. Materials flow analysis, once we are able to complete it, that kind of evaluation, this supports policy and decision making, usually at the management and government level, with the purpose of reducing the amount of waste that is produced. So in other words, management decisions can be made now to facilitate the implementation of these new strategies to reduce the waste. Some of these strategies may some of the best ways to reduce the amount of solid waste, as we mentioned before, is to reduce the consumption of the raw materials. How do we do that? Maybe if we redesign our product in such a way, it can allow us and enable us to reduce the amount of raw materials that we need. Other strategies may be to increase the rate of recovery and reuse of the materials, the waste materials. So that would be in the latter stages of the manufacturing process. How can we use the waste that is produced either for reuse or to generate fuel, recovery and fuel of the material? Here we have a nice little schematic diagram to help us understand this concept a little better. So if we are working with raw materials to produce something, we know we will start with the acquisition of the raw materials. If we're thinking about, let's say lumber, for example, raw materials acquisition of the lumber or the timber will require the use of energy. They will need equipment for harvesting, and in the process waste will be produced. Now we take this raw materials from manufacturing, let's say a sawmill, for example. This sawmill is going to have to manufacture and cut those timber into planks and different shapes, wood, etc. Again, energy is needed, and every time we use energy we produce waste as well. And in the manufacture of that we produce waste in terms of sawdust, etc. From there we produce a product, we manufacture a product. For example, it may be furniture, etc. Again, energy is used and waste is produced. The product is then used or consumed depending on what it is. Energy is used for that to happen, right? For example, if you have to purchase furniture, you have to maybe it's delivered, they need energy to deliver it. It is consumed over a period of time. The furniture will then need to be disposed when it deteriorates, and then we have to look at final disposal of it. What are the options for disposal? Landfilling, combustion through burning, recycle or reuse, right? And at each stage we can see where energy is used and waste is produced. But what are our options? If we evaluate the waste produced at each stage, there is probably something we can do to reduce it. For example, we see that when it's time for the product to be disposed at the end of its life, maybe there's some way we can reuse it. So we reuse it in a different way, we consume it in a different way. Alternatively, we can recycle. If you're following me with my cursor, it can be recycled. It can be recycled either at this stage where it is produced into another product, or it can be recycled at this stage where it is used for materials for something else. Okay, so this here is a simple summary of what materials flow analysis is all about. And again, remember, the purpose is to reduce the amount of waste that is produced from the entire process of materials use for production and manufacturing, etc. So let's talk a bit more about source reduction. Let's define source reduction first. Source reduction involves the use of strategies in the design, manufacture, purchase, or use of raw materials to reduce their quantity, the quantity of the raw materials that are used, or the materials that are used, as well as the toxicity that they produce that would eventually reach the waste stream and our environment. So for reduction to occur, that is waste reduction, source reduction, either the input or the output must be reduced. So for example, as we looked at before, in the reduction of input, maybe through the consumption of raw materials. How much raw materials are we consuming? Can we find ways to reduce the consumption so that we reduce the amount of waste that is produced? Municipal and industrial waste. So we defined municipal and industrial waste in the previous lesson. These can be reduced by reducing the quantity of materials used, as we said before. Still talking about reduction of solid waste quantities. So there's several ways in which we can do that, and we will look at them briefly. First one would be the amount of materials used in the manufacture of a product, and we would look at a few examples in the coming slides. For example, as well, the useful life of the product can be increased. I'm sure most of you, even if you are not old enough, but your parents would probably speak about this. In terms of the quality of a lot of products that are being produced now, such as, let's say, appliances, furniture, etc. The life of these products, because of the inferiority or the quality of them, they don't last long. Now, there seems to be a business strategy behind that, because if the producers can cause you to have to buy these things more often, is more money for them. But in years gone by, it was never like that. You buy a piece of furniture, it lasts for a generation, 2 generations. Okay? And as a result, because you have to buy more and dispose more frequently, you have increased waste. Other strategies for reducing waste quantities, we can look at the amount of materials that are used for packaging and marketing of consumer goods. We know packaging is a big problem. If you observe your own waste components at home, you'd see you have a lot of packaging in your garbage. How can we reduce that? We can reduce that possibly, for example, one way might be buying in bulk, where you're purchasing more of a particular product with less packaging. So yes, related to this point, major reductions will occur with changes in national priorities. Meaning, for example, if you have a government who is environmentally conscious and environmentally committed to preserving our environment, they would lead the agenda on waste reduction, for example. Or you may have changes where the result of external economic forces that might be beyond our control can influence the amount of waste we produce as well. For example, Trinidad and Tobago is heavily dependent on oil prices. Our affluence is based upon high oil prices. If you have things happening in the world where those oil prices and gas prices drop significantly, it affects our wealth. It affects our personal wealth. And when that happens, now we have to live more conservatively. If we live more conservatively, we actually produce less waste. Alright, most of you have experiences with that, you know, not only the packaging in terms of the food you consume at home, but we change phones every couple of years, computers, all of these things. And that's because we have the resources in order to purchase these things regularly. Okay, let's look at a few visual examples of how waste can be reduced. So for example, in the use of raw materials for packaging, here we have an example of looks like pharmaceuticals. If you look at the box design from before and after, you can see that there's actually a reduction in the amount of materials used. The top lids are now absent from the packaging. Here we have another example. Here we have the plastic covering package. The new product here is packaged differently, where that packaging, outer packaging, is no longer available. They've reduced the packaging therefore by 94%. Also this one here, packaging, we see again it's been redesigned. We see the before and after, and the after picture apparently is 30% less resin that is used. So these are some examples of how we can reduce packaging and the raw materials used for packaging. Let's talk a bit about reuse of solid waste materials. So the reuse of waste material now occurs most commonly in situations where a product has utility in more than one application. You can use the product in more than one way. Right? It doesn't only have to be used according to the original design and purpose for the product. For example, we see that paper bags are used to bring home groceries. We can use these bags to store household waste such as garbage. before you put them in the containers for the collection by the garbage truck. Can you think of any others? Any other ways in which you can reuse some of your products at home? Let's look at the next slide. For example, other types of waste that can be reused should be plastic containers, for example. If you have plastic containers that you bought one product in, when it's empty you can probably use it for something else. Of course, you want to be aware though of the original contents of those plastic containers, because if they originally contain some kind of toxic substance, you do not want to reuse those containers, particularly for something else, especially if you're talking about food or laundry detergent or anything like that. Other items that would normally be discarded that could be reused might be appliances, for example. Those can be fixed and even upgraded for reuse in its original form. Furniture could also be reused, again could be repaired. Glass jars can be reused, possibly for another alternative for storing something else, bottles, etc. Right? So the reuse of materials, it can be reused as originally intended or as new products. Items can be reused by repairing them, donating them to charity, or selling them. So what we're saying is you don't want to just indiscriminately discard your items like that. You know, we have a problem in Trinidad where people would take their old refrigerators and dump them in the river channels. That is environmentally irresponsible. So here we have a little collage of pictorial examples of how different types of waste can be reused. Here we can see what looks like old tires, maybe car tires, truck tires. They've actually been painted and used very nicely as pot holders for plants. Here we have paper. I don't know if that's from an atlas or something. They look like maps used to be woven to make some other kind of product. Here we have nice buckets that are used as plant holders. Old pipes used to make, it looks like maybe patio furniture or something. And this product here, I'm not quite sure what it is, if it's an old drum or something. Looks like it's used for some kind of storage as well. You have different shelves. This next slide, we have colored glass bottles that are used to possibly tiles or something like that. Across on this side we see an old bus that was actually used to make a bus stop. This was very creative. Here we have a plastic bottle that's used as a pot for a plant. And over here we have some old drums that were painted very nicely and made use of in our garden. It looks very nice. We have a few more here. We have some old buttons somebody used to make jewelry. Over here again we have the old bottles again, used to make a nice coffee table. So they provide the stand for the coffee table, and of course you can actually put plants or flowers in them as well. Over here we see I believe this may be an old phone book where this was used to make a pencil pen holder. And on this side we have it looks like toilet paper rolls that were used to make these little, looks like Halloween creatures there. Okay, so let's talk a bit about recycling of solid waste materials. So remember again, recycling and reuse are two different processes. So the recycling process is the process by which materials Otherwise destined for disposal, it is collected, processed, and remanufactured. So it's reprocessed into something else, or it could be reprocessed into the same thing. For example, we see this looks like a plastic bag. Many of us know these. Recently we are actually being asked to purchase plastic shopping bags from Massy stores. We also have the reusable ones that are available as well. The plastic bags would often be sorted for the purpose of collecting them and creating new plastic bags, so they are recyclable. So the advantages of recycling reduces the depletion of landfill space, because now you're reducing the amount of waste going into the landfill by circumventing the traditional process and rerouting your waste back into another stage. It saves energy and natural resources, so we're using less of your natural resources because we're reusing what was already used. It provides useful products and provides economic benefits, so there would be some amount of economic savings through reuse and recycling. Here we have a collection of some of the common recyclable materials. For example, we have computer paper, colored ledger paper, which would be such as file folders, envelopes, etc. Newspaper, glass, plastics, metals. Compostables would be like your food scraps, yard trimmings, etc. So if you are ever interested in recycling, one of the important things that you have to be aware of is that sorting of your material into various categories such as these. This is important because you want to keep like material with like material, because that makes the recycling process easier. For example, if you had computer paper mixed up with compostables and then moisture gets into that paper, it's going to be difficult for you to separate that food waste from the computer paper for the purpose of recycling the computer paper. So if you have commingling of the waste types, recovery and recycling of the materials become difficult. This is something we will talk about a little later on in the semester. Materials recovery. So again, this has to do with the sorting process of the materials into categories. So the many materials present in the municipal and industrial waste, they are suitable for recovery and reuse. So that sorting process is necessary, and also for energy recovery from it, right? The materials recovery process, this is preferred again to landfilling, because remember, landfilling is the least preferred option, and this is preferred to landfilling since this method reduces the bulk of municipal waste and can provide added benefit to the energy production. So if we recover the waste and we burn it now, it produces heat and it produces potential for fuel for us, right? So thereby reducing the bulk and the waste that goes to the landfill. So still referring to energy recovery through material recovery, it's important to note that as much as 70% of the components that comprise our solid waste is organic in nature. So once you have that organic waste available, it means that you have potential for producing fuel from that, energy from that. So the energy contained in the organic matter must be converted to a form that can be easily used, and that conversion process would be done by burning. So the recovery of fuel by burning the organic material in solid waste, this is a popular option, and this is what we call incineration. So if you recall on that hierarchy pyramid of the preferred solid waste management strategies, incineration was listed on that just before landfills. So at this point, I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please now proceed to eClassroom for your activity.